Dear Patriots, before the news starts, please subscribe to our patriotic channel by clicking the subscribe button. Give us a thumbs up to this video. Don't forget to leave your opinion below in the comments section. Share the news on Facebook and Twitter so you friends see it. Thank you.
Rosenstein defends Mueller. The special counsel is not an unguided missile. Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, the Justice Department official overseeing Special Counsel Robert Mueller's probe of Russian interference in the 2016 election, said Monday that criticism of Mueller's investigation from President Donald Trump and his allies is unwarranted. The special counsel is not an unguided missile, Rosenstein told USA Today in an interview published Monday evening, estimating that he spends less than 5% of his week on issues related to Mueller's probe. I don't believe there is any justification at this point for terminating the special counsel. Rosenstein did not mention Trump by name in his discussion of the widespread criticism of Mueller, although the president has led the charge in attacking the special counsel's investigation, characterizing it often as a witch hunt initiated by Democrats embarrassed by the 2016 loss of Hillary Clinton. Last June, Trump ordered that Mueller be fired but was talked out of the decision by White House counsel Don McGahn. The Deputy Attorney General said much of the work his department does is not covered by the media and is not criticized, even amid a culture of skepticism surrounding the department stirred by, among other issues, the FBI's handling of the investigation into Clinton's use of a personal email server as Secretary of State, then Attorney General Loretta Lynch's airport meeting with Bill Clinton in the closing days of that investigation, and a memo from House Republicans alleging misuse of the FISA court system by the Justice Department in relation to the Russia investigation. I believe much of the criticism will fall by the wayside when people reflect on this era and the Department of Justice, said Rosenstein, who did not refer to Trump directly. I'm very confident that when the history of this era is written, it will reflect that the department was operated with integrity. Rosenstein, who took oversight of the Russia probe in the spring of 2017 after Attorney General Jeff Sessions recused himself from all investigations related to the 2016 election, drew the ire of Trump by appointing Mueller in the wake of the firing of then FBI Director James Comey. Trump has been coy when asked whether Rosenstein enjoyed his full confidence, telling reporters in February, "You figure that one out." "I feel very confident in my ability to do the job," Rosenstein said. "In any political job, you recognize that your time is going to be limited. My goal is to get as much done for as long as I'm here in the job." Mattis in Kabul. We look toward a victory in Afghanistan, not a military victory. Kabul, Afghanistan, AP, U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis said Tuesday he believes victory in Afghanistan is still possible, not necessarily on the battlefield but in facilitating a Taliban reconciliation with the Afghan government. Mattis spoke shortly before arriving in Kabul, where security concerns were so high that reporters traveling with him were not allowed to publish stories until his party had moved from the Kabul airport to the U.S.-led military coalition's headquarters. That was the first such restriction on coverage of a Pentagon chief's visit in memory. Mattis said he would be meeting with President Ashraf Ghani and top U.S. commanders. "We do look toward a victory in Afghanistan," he said, adding, "not a military victory. The victory will be a political reconciliation with the Taliban, which has achieved a stalemate in recent years and shown little interest in conceding to the Kabul government." Mattis, a retired Marine general who commanded U.S. troops in southern Afghanistan in the opening weeks of the war in 2001, said getting the Taliban to reconcile en masse may be a bridge too far. So the emphasis is on drawing in Taliban elements piecemeal. He described this approach as an effort to start peeling off those who are tired of fighting, after more than 16 years of war. "We know there is interest on the Taliban side," he said. He defined victory in Afghanistan as a political settlement between the Taliban and the government, and an Afghan military that is capable of securing the country largely on its own. At that point, he said, Afghanistan would not be a haven for attacks internationally as it was when Al-Qaeda used the country as a launching pad for the attacks of September 11, 2001. U.S. intelligence officials are predicting the war will remain stalemated as the traditionally most intensive fighting season begins this spring. The visit is Mattis's second since President Donald Trump announced last August that, despite his instinct to pull U.S. troops out of Afghanistan, his administration would take a more aggressive approach to the conflict, now in its 17th year. As part of an effort to bolster Afghan fighting strength, the U.S. in recent weeks sent an Army group of about 800 soldiers, accompanied by several hundred support troops, to advise the Afghans closer to the front lines. The U.S. also shifted A-10 attack planes and other aircraft from striking Islamic State militants in Syria and Iraq to Afghanistan as part of Trump's new approach. These and other moves boosted the number of U.S. troops in Afghanistan by at least 3,500 to a total of more than 14,000. Mattis has said that the U.S. goal is to enable Afghan forces to weaken the Taliban to the point where the Afghans can manage their own security. Put another way, the aim is to convince the insurgents they cannot win on the battlefield, thus driving them to reconcile with the Afghan government. Stephen Biddle, a George Washington University political science professor and longtime observer of the Afghan conflict, is skeptical that the new U.S. strategy will make a decisive difference militarily, although he sees glimmers of hope for progress toward a peace settlement. He noted that both the Taliban and Afghan President Ashraf Ghani have spoken recently of pushing for reconciliation. In late February, Ghani called on the Taliban to take part in peace talks to save the country, offering security and incentives such as passports to insurgents who are willing to join the negotiations. Alice Wells, the State Department's top official for South and Central Asian affairs, said Friday at the United States Institute for Peace that Ghani's approach is more accommodating toward the Taliban than previous overtures by Kabul and deserves a thoughtful response from the Taliban. Trump, however, said on January 29 that he sees no basis for peace talks as long as the Taliban are killing people left and right. The Taliban stance is that talks for a conflict-ending compromise must take place with Washington, not Kabul. Skepticism over benefits sinks Trump-backed drug bill in House. House Republicans' bid to lift the hopes of terminally ill patients failed in an unexpectedly tight vote Tuesday night. The House of Representatives failed to deliver the deciding vote for a right-to-try bill that President Donald Trump touted in his State of the Union address and would have given terminally ill patients, or those likely to die prematurely, access to experimental medicines without the FDA's blessing. The Senate already passed its own version. Though the 259 to 140 vote fell short of the necessary two-thirds support from the House chamber, GOP leaders vowed to continue pressing the cause. The right-to-try idea, conceived by a little-known libertarian think tank, has an instantaneous appeal. But FDA, drug industry and health policy experts say it's unlikely to significantly increase the number of patients who get unapproved drugs. And the few who do could be exposing themselves to unnecessary risks while compromising medical research. I think this is feel-good legislation for legislators, rather than meaningful legislation for people in need, said Kenneth Mock, President and CEO of Cognition Therapeutics, which is trying to develop treatments for neurological conditions like Alzheimer's disease. Former FDA Commissioner Robert Califf said he worries any right-to-try law will set patients up for disappointment. What it may do is to raise expectations of vulnerable people and their families that there is some miracle cure that is going to be made available. Even if more companies release products under right-to-try, a prospect Califf thinks is doubtful, the odds for helping patients are long. That's because most promising new drugs end up being too dangerous or simply don't work. FDA estimates that only 5 to 7 of every 100 drugs that enter the first phase of human testing eventually get approved. The rest have risks that outweigh their stated benefit or don't deliver on those promises. Critics say the problem with right-to-try is it mistakenly presumes the FDA is the barrier to patients accessing unapproved medicines outside clinical trials. FDA's compassionate use program already provides experimental drugs to very sick patients, approving 99% of the requests it receives each year. It's undergone changes in recent years to make it easier for doctors and patients to navigate the process. The hurdles to accessing experimental medicines largely rest with pharmaceutical companies that have a variety of reasons for turning patients down. New drugs are expensive to make and companies need enough product for clinical trials, the only way to get FDA approval. They also need patients to be incentivized to participate in studies to get a sufficient cross-section to evaluate the product. Obtaining an experimental drug outside of a trial carries the risk of disrupting the costly and time-consuming process, especially if a person outside of a trial is harmed by the medicine. The right to try approach blames an innocent entity for access problems, and by pushing legislation that targets the FDA, those who advocate for right to try are not putting forth viable solutions to these problems. The only way forward is to work with companies and to find out what would make them willing to provide their experimental products to patients who wish to try them, said Allison Bateman-House, a bioethicist at New York University. The Trump administration's FDA chief raised these issues with House lawmakers in the fall. There is a perception that certain products that aren't being offered under FDA expanded access, will be offered under right to try, Commissioner Scott Gottlieb told the House Energy and Commerce Committee in October. I don't see that. Gottlieb, who honed in on the barriers drug companies have to providing experimental medicines, also emphasized that the vast majority of drugs provided to patients through its compassionate use program turn out to be ineffective. We know that 70% of all drugs that are offered under an expanded access setting are never approved by FDA, Gottlieb said. Right to try has been opposed by mainstream medical organization and patient groups like the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network, the American Society of Clinical Oncologists and the National Organization for Rare Disorders. The drug industry also has issues. Johnson & Johnson has already said it will continue to incorporate FDA review in all experimental access requests, noting the FDA may be uniquely aware of safety information that could affect whether a patient should receive a drug. This combination of resistance, from the FDA chief, medical groups and the drug industry, helped doom right to try in the House, even though the Senate passed the bill by unanimous consent in August. For months, Energy and Commerce leadership appeared disinclined to move a bill and worked with Democrats on an alternative proposal. But then came Trump's State of the Union appeal and congressional Republicans' annual retreat, where the White House aggressively pushed for passage of the measure. The State of the Union targeted this policy as an administration goal, thrusting the conversation into the national spotlight, an Energy and Commerce Republican aide told Politico. This spurred talks with members spearheading the law, including Senator Ron Johnson and Reps. Andy Biggs and Brian Fitzpatrick. The committee worked with those lawmakers and Vice President Pence to craft the consensus language. Energy and Commerce Chairman Greg Walden sought assurance from FDA that tweaks to the law would ensure drug companies wouldn't have perverse incentives to choose the FDA compassionate use program over right to try or vice versa. He also sought FDA feedback on getting the fastest update on patients using right to try, an aide familiar with the negotiations told Politico. The House bill also underwent tweaks to satisfy some concerns from FDA and outside groups that the law put patient safety in jeopardy. It includes new requirements that FDA be made aware when drugs are provided under right to try and gets reports of any safety events with the drugs. Those changes were lauded, but critics still argue they're not enough. I think they've certainly tried to take steps to add some important provisions like strengthening the informed consent of patients, said Jeff Allen, President and CEO of the Washington-based Friends of Cancer Research. But Allen said the bill still violates one of his organization's guiding principles: the FDA is not the problem and taking them out would only introduce more problems, he said. Allen said patients may get more access to drugs under right to try, but they are unlikely to come from credible companies who he said will prefer the FDA's process. Unfortunately, I fear it will be drugs they shouldn't be receiving or could be extremely unsafe or have flaws in the manufacturing practice or other risks that may not be known at the time. Such concerns stoked Democratic resistance. Energy and Commerce ranking Democrat Frank Pallone said the bill provides false hope to patients and their families, who will assume they will have access to investigational therapies even though the bill does nothing to require manufacturers to provide these therapies to the patient. Only one doctor has publicly said he provided patients with drug under state right to try laws. Democrats expressed frustration with the way Republicans jammed the bill through the House, noting suspension of the rules is supposed to be reserved for non-controversial measures. Had the legislation passed the House, it would have had to go back to the Senate to iron out differences such as precisely which patients would be eligible for a right to try. The House vote nonetheless marked a victory for the Libertarian Goldwater Institute, which pushed the bills through the states and on the federal level. The issue is the first in a broader anti-regulatory agenda, and could lead to the rollback of other FDA laws designed to protect consumers from unsafe and unproven drugs. Unfortunately, scare tactics, falsehoods, and innuendo win the day. We are extremely disappointed that some members of Congress chose to make this bipartisan grassroots movement partisan, Victor Riches, president of the Goldwater Institute, said after the vote. When the federal government fails, states can step in to protect patients. That's how this movement started and that's how it will continue. The group already has its next target, FDA marketing rules that keep drug companies from promoting their products for unapproved uses.